Let's begin quietly, because nothing says medieval history like large groups of people making very poor decisions over long periods of time, usually while hungry. And before we go any further, just a gentle reminder to quietly subscribe if you enjoy history told in a way that feels like a candle slowly burning out in a drafty room. Medieval people did not wake up each morning planning to push humanity toward extinction. That part mostly happened by accident. Their real goals were simple: eat something, avoid angering God, and survive the day without catching a disease named after a body part. Unfortunately, the tools available to them made all of this significantly harder. One of the most impressive ways medieval society nearly collapsed was through diet. Bread was the cornerstone of life. Unfortunately, it was often made from grain, infected with ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and the unsettling sensation that your limbs were on fire. People experiencing this were not taken to hospitals, because those did not exist. Instead, they were accused of witchcraft, demonic possession, or being inconveniently strange. Entire villages consumed the same bread, hallucinated together, and then punished one another for it. This did not help population growth. Clean drinking water was also treated as an optional luxury. Rivers served as drinking sources, waste disposal systems, and convenient places to dump animal carcasses. Medieval cities were essentially experiments in how many pathogens could coexist in one puddle. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid spread efficiently, largely because hand-washing had not yet been invented as a concept worth considering. Medical knowledge did not improve matters. Doctors believed illness was caused by imbalanced humors, evil spirits, or the moon. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and applying leeches until the patient became quiet. Silence was often interpreted as recovery. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, which meant patients had to be physically restrained while being operated on with tools that had just been used on someone else. Survival was considered optimistic. Then there were plagues. The Black Death is the most famous, but it was not alone. Europe experienced repeated waves of disease that wiped out enormous portions of the population. In some areas, entire villages disappeared. This was blamed on poisoned wells, cats, foreigners, or planets being misaligned. The actual cause, bacteria carried by fleas on rats, went unnoticed while the rats continued thriving. Religion also played a role in population decline, mostly by encouraging large gatherings during outbreaks. When disease struck, people packed into churches to pray together in poorly ventilated spaces. This allowed illness to spread faster, but at least everyone was spiritually prepared for what came next. War was another consistent population control mechanism. Medieval conflicts were frequent, long, and inefficient. Armies burned crops, killed livestock, and displaced civilians. Even when battles ended, famine followed. Soldiers rarely died heroically in combat. More often, they succumbed to infection, malnutrition, or falling off horses. Childbirth was perhaps the most dangerous everyday activity. Maternal mortality rates were high, infant mortality rates were higher, and medical intervention was minimal. Surviving childhood was considered an achievement worthy of celebration, mostly because so many did not. Despite all of this, medieval people persisted. Humanity did not go extinct, largely through stubbornness rather than planning. People adapted slowly, learned a little, and made marginal improvements over centuries. Eventually, clean water, germ theory, and basic hygiene arrived, not all at once, very reluctantly. So, when we look back at the Middle Ages, it's less a story of heroic survival and more a long series of near misses. Humanity survived not because medieval life was safe, but because it somehow wasn't fatal enough to finish the job. And with that comforting thought, we'll slowly drift onward, continuing slowly, from exactly where we left off. If there is any comfort to be found in medieval life, it is that people were rarely bored, mostly because survival required constant attention. Even resting was risky. Sleep happened in crowded rooms, often shared with livestock, insects, and whatever illnesses everyone else had brought home that evening. Privacy was not a concept. Personal space was something that would not be invented for several more centuries. Housing conditions helped maintain a steady level of danger. Homes were built from wood, straw, and optimism. Fires were common. Entire neighborhoods could disappear overnight because someone fell asleep near a candle. Smoke inhalation, burns, and structural collapse were all normal outcomes of daily living. Rebuilding was accepted as routine. Food preservation also contributed quietly to humanity's ongoing flirtation with extinction. Meat was salted heavily, smoked poorly, and stored in conditions that encouraged bacteria to feel welcome. Spoilage was often disguised with spices, not removed. If food tasted unpleasant, it was assumed to be normal. If it tasted very unpleasant, it was eaten anyway. Hunger tends to lower standards. Then there was hygiene. Bathing was irregular and sometimes discouraged. In certain periods, bathing was believed to weaken the body or invite sin. Public bathhouses existed, but they were often shared spaces where disease could circulate efficiently. Soap was rare. Perfumes were common. This solved nothing. Animals lived very close to humans. Chickens, pigs, and goats wandered freely through streets and homes. This created strong community bonds between species, along with excellent opportunities for disease transmission. Zoonotic illnesses were not understood. If a sickness came from animals, it was blamed on bad air, bad luck, or God expressing disappointment. Waste management deserves a slow mention. Chamber pots were emptied into streets. Latrines drained into rivers. Rain spread everything evenly. This system did not improve public health, but it did ensure consistency. Everyone suffered together, which was considered fair. Education did not offer much relief. Literacy rates were low, and knowledge was tightly controlled. Most people learned skills through repetition, tradition, and mistakes that sometimes ended fatally. Scientific inquiry existed, but questioning established ideas could lead to social exclusion, or worse. Progress happened, but it moved carefully, as if afraid of being noticed. Social hierarchy reinforced the risks. The majority of people had little control over their lives. Lords controlled land, food access, and protection. If leadership failed, communities paid the price. Poor decisions at the top filtered downward efficiently, usually in the form of famine or war. Festivals, meant to provide relief, often worsened conditions. Large gatherings encouraged drinking, fighting, and disease spread. Injuries were common. Medical care was not. Recovery depended largely on whether the body decided to cooperate. Yet, through all of this, people continued to form families, build communities, and plan futures. This was not optimism so much as necessity. Life went on because stopping was not an option. Each generation inherited the same dangers and adjusted slightly, very slightly. By the late medieval period, small changes began to accumulate. Better tools, improved farming techniques, marginally cleaner water in some areas. None of it dramatic. Just enough to keep the species moving forward at a cautious pace. So when we say medieval people almost wiped themselves out, it's not an exaggeration. It's more a summary of thousands of years spent living one bad decision away from disaster. The remarkable part is not how dangerous it all was, but that anyone survived long enough to improve it. And with that, we continue drifting gently through history, letting the danger remain safely in the past, where it belongs. Another quiet contributor to medieval near extinction was the calendar. Timekeeping was imprecise, seasons were unpredictable, and planning depended heavily on the weather doing what it had done last year. When it did not, which was often, crops failed. Famine followed. This was treated less as a systemic problem and more as an unfortunate surprise, despite happening repeatedly. Famine did not simply mean hunger. It weakened immune systems, reduced fertility, and made minor illnesses lethal. People became more susceptible to whatever disease happened to be passing through at the time, which was usually something. Starving populations also made practical decisions, such as eating seed grain meant for the next planting season. This solved the immediate problem briefly, and created a much larger one later. Climate did not help. The medieval warm period ended, and the Little Ice Age began. Winters grew longer and colder. Growing seasons shortened. Harvests became unreliable. There was no global communication to explain this shift, so it was interpreted as divine displeasure. The solution, naturally, was more prayer and fewer practical adjustments. Justice systems added their own subtle pressure. Punishments were harsh, public, and often fatal. Crime was broadly defined and unevenly enforced. Executions removed people from the workforce, destabilized families, and normalized violence. This did not discourage desperation, but it did reduce population numbers efficiently. Mental health was not recognized as a category. Stress, trauma, and depression were understood as moral or spiritual failings. People suffering emotionally were advised to pray harder or endure quietly. Many did, some did not. Survival required emotional resilience that not everyone had the luxury to develop. Trade routes brought wealth and ideas, but also disease. Merchants connected distant regions, carrying goods alongside unfamiliar pathogens. Cities that prospered through trade also became hotspots for outbreaks. Prosperity and plague arrived together, and separating the two was not an option. Urbanization increased risk. As towns grew, sanitation failed to keep pace. Narrow streets trapped waste and heat. Overcrowding made illness unavoidable. Rats thrived. Fleas followed. Humans adjusted poorly. Cities became population engines that consumed people as quickly as they attracted them. Even entertainment carried risk. Games, contests, and celebrations often involved physical danger. Injuries were common. Healing was uncertain. Infection turned minor wounds into fatal ones. Leisure activities were less about relaxation and more about briefly forgetting the constant threat of death. Despite everything, medieval societies were not unaware of their own fragility. People recorded disasters, famines, and plagues with remarkable honesty. Chronicles read less like triumphs and more like long lists of things that went wrong. Survival was acknowledged as temporary and conditional. Gradually, patterns emerged. Some communities managed resources better, others collapsed. Knowledge spread slowly, often rediscovered after being lost. Progress was uneven and reversible. Improvements could vanish within a generation. By the time medieval life gave way to early modern society, humanity had survived centuries of risk through persistence rather than intelligence. Systems improved not because people understood them fully, but because enough people lived long enough to notice what failed repeatedly. So the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct were not dramatic, singular events. They were everyday routines performed under difficult conditions, repeated faithfully for generations. Death was not unusual. Survival was the anomaly. And as we rest here for a moment, it's worth appreciating that we are very far removed from that world. Not smarter, necessarily, just luckier, with cleaner water, fewer rats, and slightly better bread. We'll continue drifting, calmly, knowing that history has already done the hard part. Another quiet hazard of medieval life was travel. Roads were inconsistent suggestions rather than reliable infrastructure. Travel meant exposure to weather, bandits, disease, and injuries that would not be treated properly if they happened far from home. Merchants, messengers, and pilgrims accepted these risks as part of movement. Staying still was safer, but even that came with its own dangers. Navigation relied on memory, landmarks, and hope. Getting lost was common. Being found was less so. Travelers who disappeared were rarely searched for. This was not neglect so much as practicality. Resources were limited, and missing people were an expected loss. Communication delays added to the risk. News traveled slowly, which meant warnings arrived late or not at all. By the time word of famine or plague reached neighboring regions, it had usually already arrived physically. Preventive action was difficult when cause and effect were separated by weeks or months. Occupational hazards were everywhere. Farming involved heavy tools, animals, and repetitive strain. Injuries accumulated. Artisans worked with fire, sharp instruments, and toxic materials without protective equipment. Miners inhaled dust until their lungs failed. Blacksmiths burned themselves regularly. Workplace safety was not discussed. Survival depended on endurance and replacement. Replacement was easy, because labor was plentiful. High mortality ensured a steady supply of people needing work. This reduced incentives to improve conditions. If someone died, someone else would take their place. The system functioned, but it did not care who it consumed. Nutrition deficiencies added another quiet strain. Diets were repetitive and seasonal. Vitamins were not understood. Scurvy, anemia, and rickets appeared without explanation. Weakness was attributed to character flaws rather than missing nutrients. The solution was discipline, not dietary change. Authority figures often reinforced harmful practices. Local leaders, religious figures, and elders passed down advice that was well-intentioned but incorrect. Traditions persisted because questioning them carried risk. Obedience kept communities stable, even when stability was harmful. Children were introduced early to danger. Childhood was short, and expectations were practical. Accidents were common. Survival was not guaranteed. Those who reached adulthood had already demonstrated resilience, often through loss. Grief was constant but managed quietly. Death was familiar. Communities adapted rituals to process it efficiently. Mourning happened, but life continued. Emotional endurance was a learned skill. Environmental hazards also played their part. Floods, droughts, and storms destroyed settlements without warning. Reconstruction was slow. Some areas were abandoned entirely. Others rebuilt and hoped conditions would improve. Sometimes they did. Often, they did not. Legal systems rarely protected the vulnerable. Disputes were settled through force, influence, or endurance. Justice favored those with resources. This concentrated risk among the poor, who made up most of the population. Survival was unevenly distributed. Despite all of this, medieval societies produced art, music, and literature. Creativity persisted alongside danger. People found meaning in routine, faith, and shared experience. This did not reduce mortality, but it made life feel worth continuing. Over time, small improvements accumulated again. Better plows increased yields slightly. Crop rotation reduced soil exhaustion. Knowledge spread slowly through observation rather than theory. These changes did not transform life immediately. They simply reduced the chances of total collapse. The remarkable thing is not that medieval people lived dangerously. It is that danger became normal. Risk blended into daily routine until it was barely noticed. Extinction was avoided not by awareness, but by repetition. Each generation adjusted just enough to keep going. So the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct were woven into ordinary life. Not dramatic endings, but slow pressures applied consistently. Hunger, disease, violence, and uncertainty formed a background hum that never quite faded. And here we pause again, quietly, recognizing that history did not survive because it was gentle, but because it was just survivable enough. Another factor that kept medieval society balanced uncomfortably close to collapse was record-keeping. Information was fragile. Books were expensive, rare, and copied by hand. A single fire, flood, or invasion could erase generations of accumulated knowledge. When techniques were lost, they were not recovered quickly. Sometimes they were rediscovered centuries later and celebrated as breakthroughs, despite having existed before. This fragility applied to agriculture as well. Farming methods varied widely by region, and success depended on local knowledge passed orally. When experienced farmers died during plagues or wars, their understanding died with them. Younger generations had to relearn through trial and error, which cost time, crops, and people. Economic systems were equally unstable. Coinage shortages were common. Barter filled the gaps inefficiently. Markets depended on trust, which collapsed easily during crises. When confidence vanished, trade slowed, shortages grew, and communities turned inward. Isolation reduced, disease spread occasionally, but it also reduced access to food and materials. Leadership transitions were rarely smooth. Succession disputes led to civil wars, assassinations, and prolonged instability. Entire regions could suffer because two people disagreed about inheritance. These conflicts consumed resources and lives without producing anything useful in return. Religion provided structure but also rigidity. While faith helped people cope, it sometimes discouraged experimentation. Suffering was framed as purposeful. Improvement could be interpreted as interference. This slowed adoption of practices that might have reduced risk. Change happened, but carefully, and often too late. Medical superstition lingered stubbornly. Even when observation suggested certain practices worked better than others, tradition carried more weight. Cleanliness occasionally improved outcomes, but without understanding why, it was not consistently applied. Progress stalled between insight and explanation. Migration patterns shifted unpredictably. People fled famine, war, or disease, carrying problems with them. New settlements struggled to support sudden population changes. Tensions rose. Violence followed. Stability remained temporary. Animals continued to play their part. Horses enabled war. Rats enabled plague. Livestock fed families but also spread illness. Human dependence on animals created constant exposure. Coexistence was necessary and hazardous. Even clothing contributed. Fabrics were heavy, rarely washed, and often infested. Lice and fleas thrived. Skin infections spread easily. Comfort was secondary to durability. Illness was accepted as background noise. Despite these conditions, social bonds remained strong. Community support networks helped people survive individually, even when systems failed collectively. Neighbors shared food, labor, and care. This mutual dependence prevented total collapse more effectively than institutions. As centuries passed, lessons accumulated quietly. Some mistakes were repeated less often. Others simply became less lethal due to marginal improvements. Mortality declined slowly, not dramatically, just enough. So, when we reflect on how medieval people almost went extinct, it becomes clear that extinction was not avoided through wisdom or planning. It was avoided through persistence, cooperation, and a remarkable tolerance for hardship. History did not move forward smoothly. It stumbled, recovered, forgot, and tried again. Each era built on what remained, not on what was ideal. And here we linger, at the edge of that long struggle, appreciating that survival is rarely elegant. It is usually slow, uncomfortable, and just barely sufficient. We'll continue on, quietly, letting the past remain dangerous so the present can feel calm. Another quiet strain on medieval survival was language itself. Communication across regions was limited, inconsistent, and often misunderstood. Dialects shifted every few miles, instructions, warnings, and knowledge degraded as they traveled. What began as useful advice could arrive distorted into superstition. Accuracy was fragile, confusion was durable. Law added another layer of risk. Written laws existed, but enforcement varied wildly. Justice depended more on status than evidence. The same action could be forgiven, punished, or ignored depending on who committed it. This unpredictability created fear, not order. People adapted by staying quiet and avoiding attention, which limited collective problem-solving. Isolation also played its role. Many medieval communities were effectively cut off from the wider world for much of the year. Winter sealed roads, floods erased paths, information stopped moving. If something went wrong locally, there was no outside help. Communities solved problems internally or failed privately. Food inequality intensified these pressures. Elites ate well. Most people did not. During shortages, the poor suffered first and hardest. Malnutrition weakened resistance to disease and reduced recovery from injury. Population decline followed predictable lines. Survival favored those already protected. Craft specialization created dependency. A village relied on a few key individuals for essential skills. If the blacksmith, miller, or healer died, productivity dropped immediately. Replacing expertise took years. Some villages never fully recovered from the loss of a single person. Firewood shortages added another quiet risk. Forests were overused. Heating and cooking required fuel. As nearby wood vanished, people traveled farther, increasing exposure to danger. Cold homes weakened bodies. Poor nutrition and cold combined efficiently. Superstition shaped responses to crisis. When disasters struck, blame was assigned quickly. Outsiders, minorities, or the unlucky became targets. Violence reduced social cohesion and removed people who might otherwise contribute to recovery. Fear solved nothing, but it felt productive. Aging was another unspoken challenge. Few lived long, but those who did often carried injuries, chronic pain, and limited mobility. There was no retirement. Work continued until the body stopped cooperating. Elderly people depended heavily on family. Without support, survival ended quietly. Knowledge transfer remained slow. Innovations appeared in one place and took generations to spread. There was no guarantee they would survive the journey. Progress happened unevenly, leaving large populations exposed to outdated risks. And yet, across all of this, birth continued. Children were born into unstable systems and adapted because adaptation was the only option. Each generation normalized the dangers it inherited. What would horrify us now was routine then. By the time medieval life began to shift into something recognizably modern, humanity had already passed countless invisible thresholds. Extinction had been possible many times. It simply never quite happened. Not because of foresight, but because collapse stopped just short. So, the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct were not a single story. They were overlapping pressures applied daily. Systems that barely held, bodies that endured just long enough, communities that absorbed loss and kept going. And here, once more, we pause gently. History remains heavy, but distant. The risks are real, but no longer ours. We can rest with that knowledge, letting the past stay awake so we don't have to. When you're ready, we'll continue drifting forward, quietly, 1 century at a time. Another slow pressure on medieval survival came from belief in inevitability. Life was understood as fragile and temporary, and this understanding shaped behavior. When death feels unavoidable, long-term planning loses importance. Risk becomes acceptable. Prevention feels unnecessary. Many dangers were tolerated not because people didn't notice them, but because they assumed little could be done. This attitude shaped responses to illness. When sickness appeared, people often waited. Symptoms were endured quietly until they became unbearable. Early intervention was rare, partly because effective treatment did not exist, and partly because hope was limited. By the time action was taken, outcomes were already decided. Nutrition cycles reinforced this pattern. People ate well briefly after harvest, then poorly for months. Bodies adapted to scarcity by lowering resistance. Recovery from illness slowed. Children grew weaker. Survival fluctuated with the calendar rather than medical care. Seasonal labor added strain. Planting and harvest required intense effort over short periods. Injuries were common. Exhaustion lowered awareness. Mistakes happened. Accidents became fatal when bodies were already depleted. Rest was a luxury reserved for times when there was nothing left to do. Conflict between neighboring communities never fully disappeared. Small disputes escalated easily. Land, water, and grazing rights mattered deeply. Violence disrupted food production and trust. Feuds lasted generations, draining resources quietly over time. Transportation of food was unreliable. Surpluses in one region rarely reached shortages in another. Roads were poor. Storage was limited. Spoilage erased gains. Hunger existed alongside abundance, separated only by distance and logistics. Disease immunity was inconsistent. Some communities developed resistance to local illnesses, only to be devastated by unfamiliar ones brought by travelers. Population stability depended on isolation, which also limited progress. Connection brought opportunity and risk in equal measure. Even success carried danger. When populations grew, pressure on land increased. Forests disappeared. Soil degraded. Marginal land was cultivated. Yields dropped. Growth reversed itself. Stability required constant balance, which medieval systems struggled to maintain. Leadership decisions mattered more than they should have. A single failed harvest policy or military campaign could affect thousands. Accountability was limited. Consequences spread downward. Recovery was slow. Despite all of this, people continued to imagine futures. Marriages were arranged. Homes were built. Children were taught skills. Hope existed, not as optimism, but as habit. Life continued because stopping was not an option. Over centuries, endurance shaped culture. Songs, stories, and rituals reflected loss as much as joy. Survival became a shared experience. Communities bonded through hardship. This social fabric prevented total collapse more effectively than any technology. Eventually, external factors shifted. Trade expanded. Knowledge accumulated. Sanitation improved incrementally. These changes did not feel revolutionary at the time. They simply made life slightly less lethal. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval people lived within systems that constantly tested human limits. Extinction was not narrowly avoided once, but repeatedly postponed. Each generation lived close enough to disaster that survival felt provisional. And yet, here we are. The fact that humanity made it through the Middle Ages is not proof of wisdom or strength. It is proof that life can persist under remarkable strain, adjusting slowly, enduring quietly, and improving only when it must. So we remain here for a moment, resting in the distance between then and now. The danger has faded, the lessons remain, and history, heavy and tired, finally lets us sleep a little easier. We can continue when you're ready. Another nearly invisible threat to medieval survival was the way responsibility was distributed, or rather, how it wasn't. Large systems depended on many people doing small tasks correctly, every day, without oversight. When one part failed, the consequences rippled outward. Grain not milled on time meant hunger. Wells not maintained meant sickness. Roofs not repaired meant exposure. None of these failures were dramatic on their own. Together, they were exhausting. Work routines left little margin for error. Days were long. Physical labor was constant. Fatigue dulled judgment. Mistakes accumulated. Injuries healed slowly, if at all. People worked while sick because stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant not eating. This cycle did not encourage caution. Tools were simple and unforgiving. A slip with a blade or tool could mean permanent disability. There was no compensation, no safety net, and no alternative employment. A damaged hand could end a livelihood. Dependency followed quickly. Markets reflected this fragility. Prices fluctuated wildly based on rumor, weather, or war. Hoarding during shortages worsened conditions. Trust eroded under pressure. Cooperation declined precisely when it was most needed. Infrastructure aged poorly. Bridges collapsed. Wells dried up. Roads washed away. Repairs were slow and labor-intensive. Communities patched what they could and adapted to what remained broken. Temporary solutions became permanent through repetition. Learning from failure was inconsistent. Sometimes disasters led to better practices. Other times, they led to resignation. If a flood destroyed homes repeatedly, people rebuilt in the same place because relocation required resources they didn't have. Risk was accepted as familiar rather than avoided. Health declined quietly with age and injury. Chronic pain was common. Infections lingered. Recovery was incomplete. People carried damage forward, accumulating weakness over decades. Life expectancy was short, not because people died suddenly, but because bodies wore out early. Isolation within communities also mattered. Social roles were fixed. Mobility was limited. Talents were underused. Innovation was constrained by expectation. People did what they were born into, even if it wasn't optimal. Change threatened stability, so stability was protected, even when it caused harm. Rumors spread faster than facts. Fear traveled easily. Panic led to poor decisions. Whole communities could abandon workable solutions in favor of comforting explanations. Blame replaced analysis. Action replaced understanding. And still, daily life continued. Fields were plowed, meals were cooked, children were taught trades, weddings happened, funerals followed. The rhythm of life did not stop for danger. Danger was built into the rhythm. Gradually, across centuries, pressure forced adaptation. Some practices faded, others improved slightly. Knowledge accumulated unevenly. Progress did not arrive as a wave. It seeped in slowly, often unnoticed. When we say medieval people almost went extinct, we are not describing a single moment of crisis. We are describing a prolonged state of vulnerability. A world where survival required constant effort and offered little security, where small improvements mattered enormously. The fact that humanity endured this period is less a story of triumph and more one of persistence. People adjusted their expectations, shared burdens, and accepted risk because there was no alternative. And so, we end this stretch of our quiet journey here, not with resolution, but with recognition. History survived by being just stable enough. Life continued not because it was safe, but because it remained possible. We can rest with that thought, letting the long medieval night fade gently into distance, knowing that the hardest part has already passed. Another subtle way medieval society stayed close to the edge was through exhaustion of trust. Survival depended on cooperation, but trust was fragile. When resources grew scarce, suspicion replaced collaboration. Neighbors guarded food. Villages closed themselves off. Shared systems weakened precisely when unity mattered most. Promises carried weight, but enforcement was inconsistent. Contracts were informal. Memory substituted for records. Disputes lingered. Resentment accumulated quietly. These tensions rarely exploded immediately. They simply reduced the willingness to help, which made recovery slower after every crisis. Time itself was an enemy. Days followed the sun. Nights were long and dark. Productivity depended on daylight and weather. Winter compressed activity into fewer hours, increasing pressure. Errors rose as margins shrank. Patience wore thin. Healthcare, such as it was, depended heavily on availability rather than effectiveness. Healers varied widely in skill. Some helped by accident, others caused harm with confidence. Choosing care was often a matter of proximity, not outcome. Recovery remained unpredictable. Psychological strain was constant. Fear of famine, disease, and violence never fully faded. Stress shaped behavior, shortening tempers and narrowing perspectives. Long-term thinking became difficult when short-term survival demanded attention. Generational loss amplified these effects. Plagues and wars removed entire age groups. Knowledge gaps followed. Skills were missing. Social balance shifted. Recovery required time that societies rarely had in abundance. Natural disasters ignored social order. Floods, earthquakes, and storms affected everyone. Response depended on existing strength. Weak systems collapsed quickly. Strong ones absorbed damage, but rarely improved afterward. Survival meant returning to baseline, not advancing. Trade disruptions echoed widely. A blocked route or failed harvest in one region affected many others. Dependency chains were poorly understood. Consequences arrived without explanation. People reacted to symptoms, not causes. Cultural norms reinforced endurance. Complaining was discouraged. Acceptance was praised. This helped individuals cope, but slowed collective change. Pain became normalized. Improvement felt unnecessary or unreachable. And yet, creativity persisted. Art, music, and storytelling offered escape. These expressions did not fix material problems, but they sustained morale. Emotional survival mattered as much as physical survival. As centuries passed, small shifts accumulated again. Written records improved continuity. Tools became marginally safer. Agricultural yields stabilized slightly. None of this eliminated risk. It simply reduced the frequency of catastrophe. By the end of the medieval period, humanity had survived not one danger, but many overlapping ones. Extinction had been a constant possibility, quietly present, rarely acknowledged. So the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct were woven into everyday existence. Not dramatic endings, but slow pressures endured patiently. Survival emerged not from planning, but from repetition and shared burden. And here we pause once more, letting history remain distant and heavy. The past did not rest easily. But it rests now, and we can too, knowing that even under long strain, life found a way to continue quietly, imperfectly, and just enough. One last pressure worth lingering on is how normalization worked against survival. When danger is constant, it fades into the background. Medieval people did not wake up each day thinking they lived in a hazardous world. This was simply the world. Risks were familiar. Familiarity made them tolerable. Tolerable risks were rarely challenged. Illness, for example, was expected. A cough in winter was not alarming. Fever was common. Death followed often enough that it lost its shock. This acceptance reduced panic, but it also reduced urgency. Preventable problems were treated as fate. Fate required patience, not solutions. Mortality shaped relationships. Bonds were intense but cautious. People loved deeply while knowing loss was likely. Communities developed rituals to manage grief efficiently. Death was integrated into life, not separated from it. This emotional adaptation helped people endure, but it also made large-scale loss feel manageable, even when it was catastrophic. Authority reinforced this acceptance. When leaders framed hardship as natural or deserved, resistance felt pointless. Change was slow, not because people lacked imagination, but because imagination carried risk. Stability, however fragile, felt safer than experimentation. Economic pressure encouraged short-term thinking. Feeding a family today mattered more than protecting the future. Overfarming, deforestation, and soil exhaustion were understood locally, but ignored collectively. Immediate survival outweighed long-term sustainability. Health outcomes followed the same pattern. If a treatment sometimes worked, it was repeated, regardless of harm. Without systematic observation, ineffective practices persisted. Success and failure blended together. Learning was accidental. Population recovery after disasters took generations. Birth rates rose, but resources lagged. Growth reintroduced pressure quickly. Societies oscillated between scarcity and recovery without fully escaping either. Balance remained temporary. And still, there were moments of clarity. People noticed patterns. Some communities improved sanitation. Others adjusted diets or farming methods. These changes spread unevenly, often interrupted by war or disease. Progress moved forward, then sideways, then back again. What ultimately kept medieval people from extinction was not brilliance or foresight. It was redundancy. Many communities, many approaches, many failures. Loss in one area did not erase humanity everywhere. Diversity of experience became resilience. By the time medieval life faded into something more recognizable as modern, the world had already learned hard lessons slowly. Clean water mattered, crowding killed, nutrition helped. None of this arrived suddenly. It accumulated quietly, almost reluctantly. Looking back, the Middle Ages appeared dangerous because they were, but they were also persistent. Humanity survived by absorbing damage and continuing anyway, not elegantly, not efficiently, just long enough. So the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct were not a warning ignored once. They were warnings repeated daily, lived through, adjusted to, and eventually softened by time. And now, at the end of this long, quiet path, we can rest with the knowledge that survival does not require perfection. Sometimes it only requires endurance, cooperation, and enough small improvements to tip the balance. The medieval world carried humanity forward on tired legs. It nearly failed many times. It didn't. And because of that, we're here far removed, much safer, and hopefully a little more aware. We'll let history keep its weight, and we'll keep our distance, drifting gently onward into quieter centuries. There is also the matter of memory. Medieval societies remembered suffering well, but they remembered causes poorly. A famine was remembered as the bad years. A plague became the great sickness. The details blurred, lessons softened. When conditions improved, urgency faded. When danger returned, it felt new again, even if it wasn't. This cycle repeated endlessly: crisis, survival, forgetting, repetition. Knowledge did not accumulate cleanly, it leaked. What one generation learned painfully, the next relearned slowly. This alone kept humanity hovering close to collapse longer than necessary. Institutions were not designed for resilience, they were designed for control. Castles, laws, and hierarchies protected power more reliably than people. When systems failed, they failed from the top down. Recovery depended on local effort, not centralized support. Even charity had limits. Help was personal, not systemic. A neighbor might share food, a village might support its own, but large-scale relief did not exist. Beyond immediate relationships, suffering was accepted as unavoidable. Time moved differently then. Without clocks governing life, urgency was shaped by nature. Crops dictated pace, seasons enforced patience. This reduced stress in some ways, but it also delayed response. Problems were endured until they could no longer be ignored. Conflict resolution was inefficient. Disputes lingered. Feuds persisted. Violence simmered. These slow conflicts drained energy quietly, leaving communities weaker when larger threats appeared. Innovation faced resistance not out of ignorance, but fear. New methods could fail catastrophically. Tradition had at least proven survivable. Risk-taking was dangerous when margins were thin. So improvement advanced cautiously, often reluctantly. Yet even caution was not enough to prevent disaster. Events beyond human control reshaped everything. Weather shifted, disease evolved, war expanded. Medieval life was reactive by necessity. Control was limited, adaptation was constant. What stands out most is not how close extinction came, but how rarely it was discussed. Survival was assumed. Collapse was expected locally, not globally. Humanity did not see itself as fragile at the species level. It simply lived, village by village, generation by generation. That fragmentation was its strength. No single failure erased everything. Loss was uneven. Recovery was patchwork. Civilization limped forward instead of collapsing all at once. So the medieval near extinction was not dramatic. It was administrative, environmental, cultural, biological. 1,000 small pressures rather than one decisive blow. And now, as we settle at the far end of this story, the danger feels distant. The exhaustion remains, but it belongs to the past. We can observe it calmly, safely separated by time, infrastructure, and a great deal of hard-earned knowledge. History, in this case, did not scream. It sighed, repeatedly, for centuries. And with that final, tired breath, we let the medieval world fade away, still standing, still flawed, and somehow, against its own habits, successful enough to leave us here. We'll rest now. One more quiet pressure worth noticing is how improvement was rarely coordinated. Change happened in fragments. A village improved its wells, another adjusted crop rotation. A town enforced cleaner streets for a short while. None of these efforts connected into a system. Knowledge stayed local. Success did not scale. Failure, unfortunately, did. This meant humanity improved unevenly. Some places became slightly safer. Others remained dangerously fragile. When disaster struck, it struck the weakest points first. Those losses were accepted as local tragedies, not warnings for everyone else. Distance protected and isolated at the same time. Remote communities avoided certain diseases, but they also missed advances. When contact finally occurred, it was often disastrous. Exposure arrived without preparation. Immunity lagged. Recovery was slow. Even writing, when it existed, was selective. Chronicles focused on rulers, wars, and miracles. Everyday survival rarely made the record. This distorted memory. Later generations learned about battles more than bread shortages, kings more than sanitation. The true risks of daily life remained underrepresented, even though they caused far more death. Gender roles shaped survival in quiet but powerful ways. Women bore much of the physical risk through childbirth and labor. Their knowledge about food, care, and health was essential, but often undervalued. When women died, communities lost more than individuals. They lost stabilizing knowledge that was rarely documented. Aging infrastructure added cumulative strain. Wells collapsed, roofs leaked, tools wore down. Replacement required resources that were often unavailable. Temporary repairs became permanent compromises. These compromises held until they didn't. Faith continued to offer comfort and constraint. It helped people endure suffering without despair. It also framed suffering as meaningful, which reduced urgency for change. Acceptance kept societies functional, but it slowed transformation. The natural world remained indifferent. Crops failed without explanation. Storms destroyed without intention. Disease spread without malice. Medieval people lived inside systems that could not explain these events. Without explanation, prevention remained guesswork. Still, adaptation happened. People experimented quietly. They noticed patterns. Some traditions shifted, others hardened. The balance between change and continuity tilted slowly, almost imperceptibly. What prevented extinction, ultimately, was not a single breakthrough. It was accumulation. Small gains stacked over centuries. A bit more food here, a bit cleaner water there, slightly better tools, slightly better survival odds. None of it felt decisive at the time. Humanity did not escape danger. It reduced exposure, slowly, unevenly. Enough. Looking back, the Middle Ages feel like a long test of endurance, not designed, not controlled, just lived through. People survived not because conditions were favorable, but because adaptability outpaced collapse by a narrow margin. The bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct were not bizarre to them. They were normal, routine, expected. That normalization made life possible and dangerous at the same time. And now, as this story settles into quiet, we can appreciate the distance. We benefit from systems built on centuries of trial, error, and loss. Clean water, medicine, shared knowledge. These comforts feel ordinary now, just as danger once did. History leaves us with a simple, slightly uncomfortable lesson. Survival is rarely heroic. It is repetitive, careful, often unremarkable, and it depends less on avoiding mistakes than on surviving them long enough to learn. So we let the medieval world rest where it belongs, tired, flawed, and still standing. It carried humanity forward without realizing what it was carrying. And with that, we remain here, in the quiet after centuries of strain, grateful for the distance, and calm enough to finally sleep. Continuing, gently, almost at the point where the words themselves seem optional. By the end of the medieval period, survival had become less about avoiding danger and more about managing it quietly. People did not expect safety. They expected continuity. If things did not get worse, that was considered success. Improvement was subtle enough to go unnoticed while it was happening. This perspective shaped how societies moved forward. Change was evaluated not on whether it was better, but on whether it was survivable. Radical solutions were avoided. Incremental adjustments felt safer. A slightly deeper well, a slightly sturdier roof, a slightly better harvest if the weather cooperated. Progress arrived disguised as maintenance. Knowledge finally began to linger a little longer. Writing spread slowly. Record-keeping improved. Not enough to prevent disaster, but enough to soften repetition. Some mistakes were remembered clearly enough to be avoided once or twice. That alone mattered. Population stabilized unevenly. Some regions recovered, others did not. Abandoned villages dotted the landscape as quiet evidence of systems that failed completely. These places were not memorialized. They were simply left behind. The medieval world did not end with resolution. It faded. Customs shifted. Technologies accumulated. Risks changed shape rather than disappearing. Life became less immediately lethal, but still uncertain. Survival remained work. Looking back, it is tempting to frame this era as reckless or ignorant. But medieval people worked with what they had. Their world was narrow, fragile, and demanding. They did not nearly go extinct because they were foolish. They nearly went extinct because the margins were thin and the environment was unforgiving. What saved humanity was not intelligence alone, but time. Enough time to adjust, enough time to pass knowledge imperfectly forward, enough time for small advantages to compound. So the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct were not anomalies. They were the default conditions of life stretched across centuries. Hunger, disease, violence, weather, all ordinary, all dangerous, all endured. And now, finally, we let the story loosen its grip. The medieval world has done its work. It carried humanity through a long, exhausting chapter and handed it off, worn but intact. We remain, at a safe distance, able to observe without participating. The danger has passed, the lessons remain, and history, having nearly lost everything and somehow kept going, allows itself to be quiet at last. There is nothing left to fix here, nothing left to survive, only the slow understanding that endurance, repeated long enough, becomes history, and with that, we rest. Continuing, barely above a whisper now, as if even history is ready to lie down. At this point, what remains is the residue of living that long under pressure. Medieval societies carried forward habits shaped by constant risk. Caution became instinct. Sharing became selective. Endurance replaced ambition. These traits kept communities functioning, but they also locked them into cycles that were difficult to escape. Safety improvements, when they arrived, were often accidental side effects. Better tools meant fewer injuries, not because safety was prioritized, but because efficiency mattered. Cleaner water happened when wells were moved uphill for convenience, not health. Reduced disease followed quietly, without explanation. People benefited first. Understanding came later. When understanding did arrive, it arrived unevenly. Some regions adapted quickly, others resisted. Knowledge spread like a rumor, altered, delayed, and occasionally lost. No single moment changed everything. The world improved by inches. Even then, danger never disappeared. It simply became less constant. Life expectancy rose slowly. Childhood survival improved unevenly. These changes felt modest to those living through them, but over generations, they reshaped humanity's odds. Looking back from here, the medieval period feels like a prolonged balancing act performed without a net. Each generation inherited a world already strained and made it slightly more survivable, or slightly worse. Collapse was always possible. Stability was temporary. The strange part is how ordinary it all felt at the time. People adapted to whatever conditions they were born into. Risk became background. Survival became routine. This normalization allowed life to continue under circumstances that would feel unbearable to us now. That normalization is what nearly ended everything and what saved it. Because when danger is constant, people adjust. They change habits. They share resources. They build systems that hold just long enough. Not ideal systems, functional ones. The medieval world did not come close to extinction because of one mistake. It came close because of many tolerable ones, each alone survivable, together exhausting. Humanity endured because exhaustion did not quite outpace reproduction, learning, and cooperation. And then, slowly, almost without ceremony, the balance tipped. Margins widened. Catastrophe became less frequent. Survival stopped feeling provisional. History moved on, carrying its scars quietly. So when we say medieval people almost went extinct, what we really mean is that survival was never guaranteed. It was negotiated daily, maintained collectively, relearned constantly. And now, finally, we are far enough away to let that tension dissolve. The past has done its work. It held long enough. We don't need to keep it awake anymore. History can sleep now. By now, medieval survival feels less like a story and more like a condition, a long, low pressure that shaped everything without announcing itself. People lived inside systems that were never designed for comfort, only for continuity. If tomorrow looked roughly like yesterday, that was considered success. This mindset influenced how danger was perceived. Threats were not evaluated in isolation. They blended together. Hunger overlapped with illness. Illness overlapped with labor. Labor overlapped with injury. Nothing was cleanly separated. Problems were endured simultaneously, which made solving any single one feel pointless. You could fix one thing and still suffer from 5 others. This also explains why prevention rarely took hold. Preventing one risk did not guarantee safety, so effort shifted toward coping rather than eliminating danger. People became skilled at enduring discomfort, pain, and loss. That endurance kept societies intact, but it also slowed transformation. Authority structures reinforced this balance. Stability mattered more than well-being. Order mattered more than efficiency. Leaders feared disruption, even when disruption could reduce suffering. Change threatened predictability. Predictability, however harsh, felt safer than uncertainty. Generations grew up learning what not to expect fairness, not to expect safety, not to expect longevity. Expectations were calibrated downward until survival itself felt sufficient. This psychological adjustment mattered. It allowed people to function without constant despair. It also made systemic improvement feel unnecessary. Nature remained the final arbiter. Crops failed without explanation. Weather ignored human plans. Disease moved independently of belief. Medieval people lived with a constant reminder that control was limited. Adaptation, not mastery, became the primary skill. Over time, small adaptations accumulated quietly. Tools improved slightly. Agricultural practices stabilized marginally. Trade networks strengthened unevenly. None of this removed danger. It redistributed it. Some regions became safer, while others absorbed greater risk. Humanity advanced not as a unified whole, but as a patchwork. Loss continued. Entire communities vanished. Skills disappeared. Knowledge fragmented. These failures were absorbed without ceremony. There were no global alarms, no sense of species-level risk. Collapse was local. Survival was local too. This fragmentation turned out to be crucial. Humanity did not survive because it was coordinated. It survived because it was distributed. No single failure erased everything. While one region suffered, another persisted. While one system collapsed, another continued. Redundancy replaced resilience. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval life hovered near extinction not because of one overwhelming threat, but because of constant exposure to many manageable ones. The danger was cumulative. Survival depended on keeping that accumulation just below a breaking point. Eventually, the balance shifted. Slightly better nutrition, slightly better sanitation, slightly better continuity of knowledge. These changes did not feel revolutionary. They felt like relief. Less death, fewer disasters, more time between crises. Enough to breathe. The medieval world did not solve its problems. It outlasted them. It handed forward a version of humanity that had been tested, worn down, and still functioning. That inheritance mattered. So when we talk about the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct, we are really talking about how survival works under pressure. Slowly, imperfectly, without guarantees, through habits, compromises, and a great deal of quiet endurance. And now, standing far enough away to see the whole shape of it, we can finally let the tension go. The danger belongs to the past. The effort has already been made. History carried humanity forward while barely holding together. It did not need to be elegant. It only needed to last. And it did. At the very end of this long endurance, what remains is not a lesson so much as a pattern. When conditions are harsh enough for long enough, life adapts downward. Expectations shrink. Needs simplify. Survival becomes the measure of success, and anything beyond that feels excessive. Medieval people lived inside that pattern for centuries. They did not imagine extinction, because imagining the end offered no advantage. What mattered was the next meal, the next season, the next child who might live. Scale stayed small, perspective stayed local. That narrow focus, paradoxically, kept humanity going. There was no single moment when things became safe, no clear line between danger and security. Risk faded slowly, unevenly, almost invisibly. One fewer plague, one less severe famine, a generation that lived slightly longer than the one before it. These changes felt ordinary at the time. Only later do they look like progress. What nearly ended everything was not catastrophe alone, but repetition. The same stresses applied again and again. Hunger returning, disease returning, violence returning. Survival depended on whether people could endure the repetition without breaking completely. Somehow, they did. And because they did, the medieval world quietly passed the burden forward. Not lighter, just manageable enough. The world we live in rests on that narrow margin, on centuries of people surviving conditions they could not fully understand or control. So, we let that realization settle gently. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just factual. History did not almost end once. It almost ended constantly, and then it didn't. That is all. We can stay here, in the quiet after, knowing the work is already done. Continuing, gently, without reopening anything that feels finished. What followed after all of this was not relief, but habit. Medieval societies learned how to live near danger without constantly reacting to it. This was not resilience in a modern sense. It was accommodation. Life adjusted itself around risk the way water adjusts around stone, slowly, without complaint. This meant that even when conditions improved, behavior lagged behind. People continued practices that were no longer necessary, simply because they had worked well enough before. Change required proof over generations. Trust was earned slowly and withdrawn quickly. Memory favored caution. Safety, when it increased, felt suspicious. A long stretch without famine or plague did not inspire confidence. It inspired preparation for the next one. Surplus was stored. Traditions remained strict. Optimism was restrained. Expecting improvement felt irresponsible. This cautious mindset kept societies from overreaching. Growth happened, but carefully. Expansion was limited by fear of scarcity returning. That restraint, uncomfortable as it was, prevented some collapses that might otherwise have happened faster. What medieval people almost went extinct from was not ignorance alone. It was the narrowness of their margins. Any disruption, weather, disease, conflict, could push survival past its limit. Life functioned just close enough to failure that recovery always required sacrifice. And yet, sacrifice became familiar. People expected to lose something: a harvest, a family member, a year of progress. Loss was planned for emotionally, if not materially. This expectation softened shocks enough to keep societies intact. Over time, this constant rehearsal of survival shaped culture deeply. Stories emphasized endurance over victory. Faith emphasized patience over reward. Work emphasized duty over fulfillment. These values did not eliminate suffering, but they made it bearable. Eventually, as the world shifted further away from medieval conditions, these habits became less necessary. Infrastructure improved. Knowledge spread more reliably. Risk declined, but the habits remained, embedded in culture long after the danger faded. We still see echoes of that today. Caution around food, rituals around illness, distrust of sudden change. These are not modern inventions. They are inherited responses from centuries spent living close to collapse. So the medieval near extinction did not end neatly. It dissolved slowly into memory, habit, and tradition. The danger passed, but its shape lingered. And now, finally, there is nothing left to add. The pattern has revealed itself fully. Life endured by narrowing its focus, lowering its expectations, and persisting anyway. We can remain here, in this quiet understanding, letting history rest where it belongs, no longer threatening, no longer urgent, simply complete. At some point, medieval life stopped feeling like a crisis and started feeling like weather. Something that happened around people, not to them personally. Famine years came and went. Illness passed through. Wars shifted borders. Individuals adjusted their lives to whatever conditions existed, rarely expecting those conditions to improve permanently. This acceptance shaped decision-making. Long projects were rare. Investments in the distant future felt unrealistic. Why plan decades ahead when next winter was uncertain? Effort went into what could be controlled immediately. Family, tools, shelter, routine. Ambition shrank to fit the available certainty. This also meant that when improvement did appear, it was absorbed quietly. A village with slightly cleaner water did not celebrate. It simply noticed fewer funerals. A farming method that produced steadier yields did not inspire confidence. It inspired relief. Relief did not demand explanation. It only needed to last. Danger, meanwhile, never fully disappeared. It retreated unevenly. One threat faded while another took its place. Disease lessened, but conflict expanded. Hunger declined locally, but displacement increased. Medieval life did not move towards safety in a straight line. It wandered. The constant nearness of loss created a peculiar stability. People learned what could be survived. Systems evolved not to prevent catastrophe, but to recover from it. Redundancy mattered more than efficiency. Multiple ways to do the same task mattered more than doing it well. When a mill broke, another might exist. When a road washed out, paths formed around it. When authority failed, informal networks filled the gap. These systems were not elegant. They were resilient in a quiet, improvised way. What almost ended everything was not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of margin. Medieval societies lived close to the minimum conditions required for continuation. Any improvement mattered enormously. Any setback hurt disproportionately. Survival was a balance maintained daily, without acknowledgement. And still, the balance held. Not because it was stable, but because collapse was rarely total. Pieces fell away. Others remained. Life reassembled itself repeatedly from what was left. Eventually, enough small advantages accumulated that the balance shifted decisively. Risk did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. Survival stopped consuming all attention. Space appeared for curiosity, planning, and change. But that came later. For most of the medieval period, humanity lived in the narrow space between enough and not enough, between endurance and exhaustion, between habit and collapse. That space was uncomfortable. It was dangerous, and it was lived in for centuries. And now, finally, we are far enough away to let it go. The pressure no longer applies. The balance no longer needs to be maintained. History did its work quietly. It did not announce success. It simply continued. And so do we. There is nothing more to survive here. Nothing more to endure. Only the quiet recognition that humanity passed through a long, difficult chapter without realizing how close it came to the end. That recognition can rest now. So, we rest too. What finally made the medieval world feel survivable was not safety, but predictability. Danger remained, but it became familiar enough to plan around. People learned the rhythms of risk the way they learned the seasons: when to store, when to travel, when to stay very still and wait. This predictability did not remove suffering, it organized it. Famine no longer felt random if it arrived on schedule. Illness no longer felt shocking if it returned every winter. Repetition gave events a shape, and shape gave people something to prepare for, even if preparation was limited. Preparation often meant restraint, eating less in good years to survive bad ones, avoiding growth that could not be sustained, keeping families small when resources were thin. None of this was easy or consistent, but it reflected a long familiarity with consequences. Risk management became cultural rather than technical. Proverbs warned against excess, customs limited behavior, traditions regulated work, rest, and consumption. These practices did not eliminate danger, but they slowed its impact. They bought time. Time mattered. Time allowed bodies to recover. Time allowed crops to regrow. Time allowed communities to reassemble after loss. Without time, survival would have failed repeatedly. Medieval life was built around stretching time wherever possible. The cost of this approach was stagnation. Innovation moved slowly. Ambition remained cautious, but stagnation was preferable to collapse. A world that did not improve was still a world that continued. Gradually, almost without intention, this conservative strategy paid off. Small improvements had space to take hold. A better tool survived long enough to spread. A cleaner water source stayed clean long enough to be noticed. A medical practice worked often enough to be trusted. Change embedded itself quietly. By the later medieval period, humanity was no longer balanced so precisely on the edge. The margin widened slightly. Not enough to feel safe, enough to feel less desperate. That difference mattered more than it sounds. Children survived more often. Adults lived a little longer. Skills persisted across generations, instead of vanishing suddenly. Memory held better. Knowledge stacked rather than resetting. These gains were cumulative. They did not announce themselves, but they reshaped the future. Looking back, it becomes clear that the medieval world did not avoid extinction by escaping danger. It avoided extinction by outlasting it, by allowing small, boring improvements to accumulate under the cover of routine. Nothing dramatic saved humanity. No single discovery, no heroic intervention, just persistence, shared effort, and the refusal to stop, even when stopping might have seemed reasonable. So, the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct were never truly bizarre to those living through them. They were simply the conditions of life, endured without comparison to anything better. And now, at the very end of this long telling, there is nothing left to add. The shape of survival is complete. The pressure has been described from every angle. The medieval world was not kind. It was not clever. It was barely sufficient. And somehow, that was enough. We can leave it there, quietly, without ceremony. History does not need applause. It only needs distance. And with that distance, finally, we rest. Continuing, softly, as if even the idea of continuation is mostly habit now. At the furthest edge of medieval endurance sits something simple and unremarkable. Routine. Not bravery, not innovation, routine. People survived by doing the same things every day, with minor adjustments and very low expectations. Wake up, work, eat whatever existed, sleep, repeat. This rhythm carried humanity forward more reliably than any grand plan. Routine reduced decision-making. Fewer choices meant fewer mistakes. When life is dangerous, choice is expensive. Medieval societies limited choice through custom, obligation, and repetition. This felt restrictive, but it conserved energy. Energy mattered more than freedom. Risk was managed by predictability rather than prevention. People accepted that some years would be bad. They planned emotionally for loss, even if they couldn't plan materially for it. Hope was quiet and conditional. Expecting too much was considered reckless. The idea of progress did not exist as a goal. Improvement happened incidentally. When something worked slightly better and didn't immediately cause harm, those improvements were adopted cautiously, copied slowly, and abandoned quickly if they failed even once. Survival favored conservative change. This caution explains why medieval life feels stagnant from a distance. But stagnation was protective. Rapid change could destabilize already fragile systems. Stability, even painful stability, allowed societies to persist long enough for real improvements to embed themselves. What nearly ended humanity was not a lack of solutions. It was the cost of experimentation. When failure meant starvation or death, innovation became a gamble few could afford. So life remained harsh but familiar. Familiarity kept people alive. Over centuries, this produced a strange resilience, not the kind that thrives under stress, but the kind that bends and stays bent without breaking. Communities absorbed shock, adjusted minimally, and continued. Collapse happened locally, not globally. This fragmentation mattered. Humanity survived because it was never all in one place, all under one system, or all exposed to the same failure at once. Diversity of suffering became diversity of survival. While one region failed, another endured. While one approach collapsed, another limped on. Eventually, the environment shifted just enough to reward endurance. Slightly better climate stability, slightly improved tools, slightly more reliable food production. These advantages did not remove danger. They widened the margin. A wider margin meant mistakes were no longer always fatal. From there, change accelerated, not suddenly, but noticeably. Knowledge survived longer. Children reached adulthood more often. Communities rebuilt faster. The balance tipped away from extinction and toward continuity with room to breathe. But none of that would have happened without the long medieval habit of surviving without improvement, of enduring conditions that felt permanent, of continuing anyway. So when we talk about the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct, we are really describing a world that functioned just below the threshold of collapse for an astonishing length of time. A world that should not have lasted, and did. There is no moral here, no inspiration, just observation. Survival is not glamorous, it is repetitive, it is cautious, it is often dull, and it works. And now, at the true end of this quiet journey, we can finally stop moving forward. There is nothing left unresolved. The story has reached its natural conclusion, which is simply that it continued. The medieval world did not know how close it came to the edge. It did not need to. It stayed upright long enough. That is all history ever really does. And that is enough.